Thank you very much for being here. We have Dr. John Dorschner, University of Arizona, Tucson, professor at the program at the Center for Government and Public Policy. School, yes. And his background is rather important for the topic that he's going to talk about. He was a former American Foreign Service officer who served in India, among other places, and is an honorary Indian by the virtue of having married an Indian lady, and who's in Nagpur for an big fat Indian wedding. So he's, I think, quite familiar with the Indian setting and reality, etc. And I thought it would be very interesting to have him as an ex-Foreign Service officer to talk about the changes in the United States' relations with the outside world, especially in the practice of diplomacy. What has changed? Because if you look at the record, you have Tillerson coming in and pretty much carrying out Trump's brief in terms of literally shredding the State Department in lots of very bad ways. And maybe John here will tell us just how it has hurt, I would suspect, has hurt diplomacy. But nevertheless, I think within the constraints, all foreign services have to carry on in whatever constraints, with whatever constraints and the kind of contingencies they face. And so it'd be interesting to hear from him the difficulties I think that American diplomats face in their foreign postings. And if you will, John, you may also wish, perhaps with your depleted strength of the embassy in terms of whether it's quality, quantity, or whatever. I'm not sure what the effect has been on the on your embassy here in Delhi, about your diplomatic, the outcome of U.S. diplomacy in India, how it has affected India as sort of a sidebar to your main topic. Over to you, John.
So right now at the University of Arizona, I'm teaching undergraduates. There was a time when the Foreign Service used to be called the career, and the saying was that the best and the brightest went into the Foreign Service. And now I have undergraduates, and that idealism is not there. They're not starry-eyed and dying to take the Foreign Service exam and get into the Foreign Service like I would have expected. They're far more realistic, I think. And because I'm in Arizona, I have a lot more students actually going into the Border Patrol than the Foreign Service, because the Border Patrol is a growth industry in the United States, and especially in Arizona, and they have an assured job, whereas there's no assurance of any job if you try to have a Foreign Service career. So it's very interesting. My problem when I'm dealing with undergraduate American students is that we're trying to take a chaotic world and we're trying to impose some order on that world, and what we do is we use ideology to try to put together a grand scheme of things, and then we use individual theories as our tactics to try to bring those ideologies into play and have outcomes that we want to see happen. And the Trump administration has turned this all around, because all of these signposts that we use with undergraduates are no longer in play. All this terminology that I also taught at West Point, and I had West Point cadets, and our class was called the Theory a Day class, because these were future military officers, and they were being taught all these IR theories one after the other to try and make sense of their job as being in the American Army and being all over the world. So it's a difficult thing to do now, and so we have to ask ourselves what makes it so difficult, and what has happened and what we can look forward to in the future, and then cap it all off with what is going to happen with Indo-American relations in light of all this chaos that the United States is going through in American foreign policy. And when I talk about American foreign policy, I like to tie it in with American domestic policy. I'm not sure what kind of exposure Indians have in their media to our domestic politics. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't show any interest whatsoever, because it's a pretty god-awful thing to have to watch every day. But the tie between domestic politics and foreign policy in the United States is very, very strong, and we're seeing that play out with this whole Trump phenomenon. So when I have undergraduates, whether they're at West Point or the University of Arizona or wherever they may be, I always start with trying to put them into the big picture. And the two contending players are always the realists and the liberals. But and IR theorists like to make a clear demarcation between these two schools of thought and have the realists and the liberals contending against each other. But in reality, usually the stereotype is that the Republican Party is the realist party and the Democratic Party is the liberal party. But in reality, looking back on 27 years in the Foreign Service, the Republicans seemed just as tied to a lot of the liberal stuff as the Democrats, and there wasn't really a clear demarcation. And now we're starting to see that demarcation, and we're starting to have parties with totally opposed points of view. But I would argue, I would contend that what Trump is pushing is not really realism, because he doesn't understand such concepts as realism. He's not a thinker, he's not a reader, and he doesn't have the depth of knowledge that my undergraduates have at University of Arizona, and they have a lot of problems with realism. The cliche that people like to make in the American press, I don't know if you hear this in the Indian press, is that Trump is an isolationist. He wants the United States to withdraw from the world, and this is particularly true in light of what happened yesterday with the resignation of Secretary Mattis. Secretary Mattis made it quite clear that he was disgusted with Trump's foreign policy orientation, and he couldn't tolerate being in the administration any longer. But my experience has been dealing with foreign policy elites from the United States, whether they be from Congress or the Department of State, the executive branch, academia. Everyone up till now has embraced the liberal worldview and the entire liberal world order that the United States established after World War II. And this was the paradigm that we were operating under. For 27 years, I operated under this. When I first started, we were winning the Cold War, and it was the tail end of the Cold War, and then we won the Cold War, and everyone said that this was the end of history. Remember Fukuyama, the end of history, and the liberal world order was going to be permanently established, and democracy would become universal, and war would become obsolete. When I was teaching at West Point, I used to call this the Star Trek vision of the world, and I would show them clips of Star Trek. And if you watched Star Trek, the people who made Star Trek, they're dyed-in-the-wool liberals. They believe in progress, and they believe that man can achieve a utopian kind of society in which there is no more disease, old age, no more poverty, no more crime, sexism, racism, whatever. And that's the orientation that I think everybody in the foreign policy establishment had, and it came down to more a question of methods rather than outcomes, because the people who Americans wrongly called realists were people who were interested in hard power and using the military, and people who were derided as liberals were the people who were interested in soft power and wanted to bring a strong stress on values. And so, but the funny thing about American foreign policy has been that no matter how Neanderthal or right-wing an American politician is, they all have to talk about how the United States stands for values, and that we want to be a shining beacon to the world, and we want to fight for human rights and democracy all around the world. And I remember before Trump was elected, in class we used to talk about universal human values and how all these undergraduates would be reading international law, and the trend is to have an international criminal court in which any abuser of human rights could be drawn up and tried for their human rights abuse. And now I'm teaching the same undergraduates, but all that has been thrown out the window. So what is responsible for this phenomenon, and what is the impact that it's going to have? So American domestic politics is at the center of what has happened. Every single poll that's been taken of Americans by social scientists about why they vote and how they vote, foreign policy and security issues are at the bottom of their consciousness. Invariably, the average American votes his pocketbook, his or her pocketbook, and the overwhelming concern is economic issues. The Democrats cleaned up in this last election and recaptured the House because they talked about health care. That's an issue that Americans can relate to. Americans are some of the most unhealthy people in the entire planet, and they rely on big pharma and big medicine to keep them going from one day to the next because they're too lazy to exercise or eat proper diet. And so it's a huge issue for Americans. And we have an opioid crisis, an opioid epidemic. So these are the kinds of issues that Americans are drawn to. And if you were to say you should vote for the Republican Party because of its foreign policy, that's not why this tiny, relatively small group of people were able to propel Trump into the presidency. It wasn't because he said that he was an isolationist and he was going to withdraw from the world. It's because he promised blue-collar Americans, primarily white blue-collar Americans, and a lot of them in rural areas, that he was going to give them the sun, the moon, and the stars, that they were going to get their manufacturing jobs back, and they would be making automobiles, and that the Chinese weren't going to be taking our jobs away anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what was motivating the United States. And so that propelled Trump into power, and then we had a guy in the executive office who the last 2 years have revealed is totally unfit to hold that office. So he doesn't have the basic qualifications to be president of the United States. So you talk about being over your head, in over your head, he's like at the bottom of the deep end of the pool and can't really even get his head above water because it's all way too complicated for him. And it's not just foreign policy, but it's domestic policy as well. But his knowledge of foreign policy is non-existent. So we have a head of state for the first time in American history who doesn't even have the most basic qualifications. And one of the big issues that drives American foreign policy is political economy. And if we had Trump here in the room, and we were to ask him to talk about his views on political economy, I'm pretty sure he would just give us a blank look and say, I have no idea what you mean by political economy. He cannot describe even basic economic terms. He thinks that if we have a trade imbalance, which with the country we're actually losing money because we have a trade imbalance, he doesn't understand the difference between a deficit and a trade imbalance, which is the kind of thing that we would have learned in Economics 101 when we were freshmen back at the University of Arizona. And I'm sure at your alma mater, when you took your first economics class, you were taught all these very basic terms. And so the cliche is that when it comes to political economy, he's embraced mercantilism. And there was a good wrap-up today in the Washington Post when they're talking about Mattis's resignation, that he has a vision. It's Back to the Future. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's Back to the Future. But most Republicans have a vision of a golden age when women were in the kitchen and we didn't have all this immigration of brown and black people coming into the United States, and there were no Muslims anywhere. But they're thinking of the 1950s. They're not thinking, he goes much farther back than that. He's going all the way back to pre-World War II, and he's espousing and embracing policies that no serious IR practitioner or theorist would have embraced in the last 70, 80 years. We're talking the 1930s, even before the 1930s, the kind of tariff policies that he's talking about. You have to recall that the United States embraced tariffs for the last time in the 1920s when they put the Smoot-Hawley tariffs on imports into the United States, and the result was the Great Depression. And ever since the Great Depression, no economist of any repute has even discussed tariffs. They were a dead issue, and now he's trying to resurrect these tariffs and has this whole mercantilist approach to political economy, that there are only winners and losers. And the whole liberal worldview is that the liberals believe in a win-win world where if you follow liberal policies, every country on earth is going to benefit and every person in that country is going to benefit. This is where it gets really airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky kind of thinking. To have an ideology that actually believes that you can pursue a policy in which there are no losers and winners. But he embraces everything for a mercantilist is about winners and losers. And I'm surprised I'm even using this term, mercantilist, because it has been excised from the classroom for so long. I don't think any undergraduate class would ever teach mercantilism because they would say, well, what would be the point? But now we have a president who's trying to embrace this, resurrect this failed policy. And when I'm teaching undergraduates, I like to say that, or the theorists, not me, the theorists like to say that the realists have a suspicion of multilateralism, and the liberals embrace multilateralism, but he takes this to the extreme because he's not capable of subtle thinking. And if you're not capable of subtle thinking, everything is black and white. And so if conservative Americans are suspicious of multilateralism, he just automatically assumes that any multilateral initiative or multilateral organization is going to be bad. And so he embraces unilateralism, which is, again, another policy that we haven't heard about unilateralism in a long time. When I used to teach about unilateralism, I used to talk about G.W. Bush as being the principal person who embraced unilateralism, because when the UN did not endorse his plan to invade Iraq, he said, to hell with the UN, we're going to act unilaterally, and created a coalition of the willing that was going to invade Iraq. But now we're hearing a unilateralism taken to a whole new height that we haven't heard of before. And so I would call this not realism like the way we study realism in our IR textbook. It is realism. It's an intense kind of hyper-realism. It's based not on IR theory, on the works of the great IR thinkers and writers, of which there are very, very many in the realist canon. I mean, don't get me wrong. Any IR practitioner, diplomat, or academic that teaches IR would say that realism is the dominant philosophy in all diplomacy, even today. Most people would say that realism is what we practice, and liberalism is the veneer of things we wish we did, and that we place over this realism. But if you take that veneer away and you just say we're going to do nothing, that every single policy we do is going to be realism to the max, that seems to be what the Trump administration is doing. And so, as I alluded previously, the Trump administration, one of the first things they did was make it clear that the United States would be no longer concerned with human rights abuse. And so under his administration, the United States has embraced a number of countries who are noted human rights abusers. I'm sure they all come to mind. He embraced Vladimir Putin, who routinely murders people who are his opponents and journalists and so forth. I don't think there is a plutocrat or an autocrat or a human rights abuser anywhere on earth that he hasn't expressed admiration for. This is quite a shock for the American people because, as I said, it was the norm for every American involved in foreign policy to at least pay lip service to the human rights issue, and now that's been removed, and you don't even pay lip service to human rights anymore. That's a huge difference. And the thing that characterizes liberals is that they are obsessed with morality, and they want foreign policy to be moral, and they want it to be driven by moral concerns. And Trump is the epitome of moral relativism, not just in foreign policy. The reason why we have a morally relativistic foreign policy is because the head of state is a moral relativist. He doesn't have liberal values. He doesn't have any values. And so the only thing that matters, you can do anything you want, anytime you want, and the only thing that matters is winning. So that's very, very difficult for a practitioner, a diplomat, to get used to, because we're taught from day one, and when I was at West Point, military officers were taught from day one that we were never to do anything or espouse any policy that ran counter to universal human rights. One of the first things they tell West Point cadets their very first year at West Point is that you are never to follow an illegal order. And one of the big fears among my military colleagues and my West Point colleagues after Trump's election was they were terrified that he would order them to do something that ran counter to international human rights law. You can think of all kinds of things he could order, carpet bombing a city, you name it. And that was why General Mattis was so highly regarded, because he was sort of like the guy that could keep him in check, because General Mattis personified military professionalism in the American military. And he made it clear that, and all my military colleagues made it clear that they would never carry out an order from Trump. Then we would be in a Days of May situation if that happened. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It was a big book and film in the 1960s, 60s. Yeah, 7 Days in May, where the military feels that the executive is out of control and they can't follow an illegal order, and they feel they have to step in. And we've never had a military coup in the United States. So that my military colleagues were extremely nervous about this. And you can imagine my foreign service colleagues are placed in the same situation, because we're where the rubber meets the road, and we meet people all over the world and we may be the only American they're ever going to meet, and they read about Donald Trump and they read about our foreign policy, and here we're stuck trying to answer all their questions. Very strange. So the reason I would state that one of the big reasons why we have a Trump phenomenon is because of American domestic politics. If you look at who voted for Donald Trump and who may vote for Donald Trump in the future, the number is shrinking. But they say that the group that is most strongly attached to Donald Trump is Protestant evangelicals, what we call Protestant evangelicals. And if you're not familiar with American society, this can be a very mystifying term, and it's actually a mystifying term to Americans. In India, you're seeing the phenomenon of the mating of politics with religion, and you have secular parties, the Congress Party and the left parties espouse secularism, and then you have a dominant party now that is in control of the government that is trying to mix religion and politics, and that's the same thing that's going on in the United States. And Donald Trump, who himself since he's amoral and he's a moral relativist, he's not going to embrace Christian values, and he's not a practicing Christian. But the Christian evangelicals have almost made a deal with the devil in the sense willing to vote for Trump every time for the promise that he will meet their list of demands. And so this has a not just a domestic component, because it doesn't only affect policies, our social issues, which is what American evangelicals are most concerned with, primarily abortion and gay rights, but it affects our foreign policy. And we can talk about that because the only time the Trump administration talks about human rights, in essence, what they mean is not human rights, they mean Christian rights. And so when they say they're standing up for oppressed minorities all over the world, they're standing up for an oppressed minority all over the world. And so this has put the United States executive branch and civil servants and foreign service officers in an awkward position, because now the United States government, oddly enough, is in the position of supporting only one religion instead of having a universal application of trying to defend people anywhere. And I think one way that he's placated the religious right in the United States is that he has taken an anti-Islamic agenda. And because the American evangelicals, I don't want to bore you with theology, I mean, that's a whole other subject, but the American evangelicals represent a certain school of Christianity. They don't represent all of Christianity. There are thousands of different kinds of Christians, but Christian evangelicals have a literal interpretation of Christianity that everyone on earth is going to go to heaven or hell after they die, and that anyone who is not born again and accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior is going to go to hell. And of course, that excludes all Muslims. And so a lot of evangelical preachers have a religious attack against Muslims and against Islam, and so this is going to affect our policies in the Middle East and around the world where we're dealing with Muslims. And the other huge problem for American Foreign Service officers would be your attitude towards democracy. It used to be a given when teaching undergraduates IR, like I said, that democracy was on the march around the world. Autocracies, one-party states, states that abuse human rights were all on the way out. And it was the duty of every American to stand up for democracy. And so now you're in a whiplash situation where if you're a mid-level foreign service officer, you've been told that this is your orientation for 15, 20 years of your career, and then suddenly it's off the table, and you're no longer to talk about this issue any longer, and you're supposed to get in bed with dictators all around the world. So this is hard for foreign service professionals to stomach. So this is one reason why we have seen an exodus of foreign service officers from the United States Foreign Service. So the senior-most people who they're serving at their own behest, they don't need to be in the Foreign Service. They were serving because they loved their country, or they loved their profession, or they thought they were doing good. And then with the election of Trump, all that came to an end, so they all put in their retirement slips and are happily teaching IR somewhere, or on the board of directors, or at a think tank somewhere. But what happens to the mid-level people? My sister-in-law is a mid-level officer. She has had to work ever since Trump was elected at jobs 2 and 3 grades higher than her own job. She's had to work 14 hours a day, cleaning up messes, doing the jobs of 2 or 3 people. And in the Foreign Service, we always said, oh, we're always willing to do more with less, but we're not willing to do the jobs of 3 people. A lot of people just get burned out, and they say, I'm not gonna do this anymore. So that's a real problem. And then one of the big tenets of liberal foreign policy that I think most Republicans also embraced was that it was the job of the international system to prevent state aggression by one state against another state. And Donald Trump has thrown this out the window as well. So we thought we were fighting the good fight and preventing when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and annexed Kuwait. The United States led the charge to preserve the sovereignty and integrity of Kuwait, which was the victim of international aggression, one strong state against a weak state. Now, Russia is in the process of absorbing Crimea and is grabbing territory all around the old USSR, and all these former Soviet republics are finding themselves undermined by Putin, and the United States is silent. And so this is like a very basic tenet of diplomacy that has been overturned by this administration. And I can't help but mention, to hearken back to the Christian evangelicals, the hard shift in our Middle East policy. For a long time, we were always told that the Americans were the honest interlocutors in the Middle East, and that we wanted Middle East peace, and that we wanted a Palestinian state that could live side by side at peace with Israel. And that has also been thrown out the window. So now he arbitrarily just moved the capital of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He more or less told the Palestinians to forget that they'll ever have a state, and that they should just accept dominance by Israel from now until eternity. And this is not the kind of position that highly educated diplomats are going to passively accept or support. This is fine for his vote bank in rural America, who has some very exotic and very complicated theological reason why they want the American embassy to be in Jerusalem, which we don't have any time to go into. But it's not going to fly with professional Foreign Service professionals. And so my argument would be that since he's essentially a vacuum when it comes to foreign policy, it's an empty space. He has filled that space by taking on people he thinks are expert advisors. And this is primarily, I would say, Pompeo, the current Secretary of State, and Bolton, the current National Security Advisor. And they were banished and in the wilderness for a long time, and if Hillary Clinton had become president, they probably would never have held public office again in their lives. And so now they have their big chance, and their ideas are so odd and so retrograde that, and he has the president's ear. It would be like if you had some idea, some notion in your head that you've always wanted to carry out, and the president calls you up and says, hey, you could do anything you want. And so one of the things that they would like to do is overthrow the government of Iran and actively side with Saudi Arabia in a dispute within Islam between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Why the United States, as a secular state, would have any bias one way or the other in this dispute, or why we would favor Iran or disfavor Iran and join with Saudi Arabia is beyond people's comprehension. And so this has led to all this speculation that I don't know if you're getting this in the Indian press, but in the American press, it's 24 hours a day, just repeated over and over again. When the new Congress starts investigating Trump, they're going to find that he's up to his eyeballs in debt to Saudis, that it's the Saudis who are propping up his failed business empire, and that he's compromised himself, and that he's somehow motivated. I tend to believe that because he's vacuous in his foreign policy approach, that he's willing to do whatever Pompeo and Bolton say. And if you read anything about these two people, Bolton in particular has been very outspoken. He's spoken to all kinds of crazy groups that want to overthrow the government of Iran, and why this is supposed to be such a high priority for the United States somehow escapes me. But anyway, so what are the implications of all of this? Let me see. How much time do I have?
Another 10, 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll zip through. The implication, and end up with the India side. So the implications for the Trump era, I would argue that there was always a lot of hypocrisy in American foreign policy. The liberals were hypocritical because they espoused liberalism while secretly embracing realist principles every chance they could get. And the Republicans were hypocritical because they would always pay lip service to America as the beacon on the hill, and how much they loved democracy, and they wanted democracy everywhere, and they loved human rights. But it just became an empty mantra that they repeated over and over, and then would go ahead and do realist policies, sort of give them a blanket cover. But it shows that Americans up until now felt compelled to say the right thing, if not do the right thing. They always, you can count on Americans to say the right thing. And in my diplomatic experience, we were known as the preachers of the world. Everywhere, American diplomats, if an American diplomat entered the room, everybody would say, "Oh no, here they come, here they are, they're going to start preaching to us about the city on the hill, and the American exceptionalism, and human rights, and how the United States is the model for all the rest of us." And people weren't, my interlocutors from my host countries weren't really very excited about hearing us go on and on like that. But now that's all been removed. And so what does the United States represent now? That's the big problem. Is the United States going to be dragged into the same category with Putin's Russia, or Turkey, or some other authoritarian state? I really don't think so. But we're in this sort of purgatory, this interregnum between the way life was, the way life is now, and the way life will be. And with every passing day, especially having just read all this today about Mattis's resignation and so forth, Trump's contradictions are all starting to fall in on him, and I would argue that the policy elites in the Republican Party will have no qualms whatsoever about throwing him under the bus if it comes to their own political survival, because they are political realists. So how does this impact India? I would say that the Trump agenda, depending on your what kind of Indian you are, what your political orientation is, you will find positive and negative things in the Trump agenda. I would point out the Trump base is shrinking. Trump has not tried to broaden his appeal to his base, and his base is getting more and more restricted, and it's becoming more and more linked to white supremacy. So if your base is white supremacist, and you're in a country where nobody is white, that makes it very difficult to have an equitable relationship with that country. And I would argue that the Republican elites that are supporting Trump, they have their own agenda, and it's primarily an economic agenda, because GOP elites are the class of wealth. If you remember back during the Occupy days, everybody in the United States was talking about, we are the 99%. Well, they are the 1%. And to use Marxist terminology, their behavior is motivated by class interest. They're interested in the 1%, meaning they, their families, and their friends. And they have been given the power to manipulate the entire economic system to benefit themselves and their social class. So this is going to have a strong impact on Indo-US policy because they want to practice a naked kind of capitalism without inhibition, and they see India primarily as a market, and they don't believe in soft power. They're not interested in pie kind of relationship where we're all going to be embracing each other. They want to exploit India. They want to make a profit in India. And they want to influence the Indian government to open up the country to American investment, remove troublesome labor laws that keep them from making greater profits, and they want to convert Indian society into a huge consumer society that's going to be a market for American goods. And so if you are hooked on that agenda, they believe that the Modi government is 100% on board, that the Modi government is on board to this agenda, that they believe their definition of free trade is, I would say, a relativistic definition of free trade because they would like to dominate the Indian market, and they would like to see cheap Indian goods going to Walmart, but a lot of profit coming into their pockets. And the big problem is going to come down to culture wars because India is not in a good position when it comes to the culture wars that are raging as Trump gets more and more desperate and tries to hold on to power and is more restricted and his base becomes smaller and smaller and more extreme. You're going to see a lot more xenophobia. And India is about, I would argue that culturally, India is about as far from Nebraska or rural Arkansas or Alabama as you can possibly get. And these people don't like things that are different and strange. And they find India very different and very strange. And India is not a Christian country, so it's sort of off there. It's sort of in an area of darkness, and so the soft power thing doesn't work with them, and the whole soft power thing that the liberals were cultivating, where they were thinking of having an embrace one democracy to another, these two democracies side by side developing together, is not going to play with this group. I would argue that the GOP elites would like to replicate the same kind of system and see it in India. We just had the Ambani wedding, and it epitomized naked consumerism. I think a lot of Americans, the Republican elites, could embrace that. They could say this is the kind of world that India should have, where you have the haves and the have-nots, and you have a lot of have-nots and very few haves. Yeah, and so all that xenophobia. And like I had said before, the whole Islamic thing, I think if you're a BJP supporter, if you believe in Hindutva, and you believe that Islam is a threat to India, that Pakistan is a threat to India, you're going to like the Trump agenda. You're going to like the Trump because Trump has made it very clear that he doesn't want Muslims in the United States. He doesn't want Muslim immigration. He doesn't want to be close. But why he's in bed with the Saudis, I don't know. It's part of the contradictions that we have. And we already talked about Israel. We talked about American markets. Oh, and one very odd thing about the Trump administration is that they're anti-science, and so science plays no role in their decision-making, and they X out science. And so if you're a scientist in America, imagine if you work for the Environmental Protection Agency and you're a scientist, or even NASA, if you're not allowed to even mention climate change. And the United States is pretty much the only country in the world now where climate change is not widely accepted by everyone. So if India, Trump would like to see India join with them in this in this pro-coal, pro-fossil fuel, let's pollute the environment kind of thing. And the Indians are never going to do this because the Indians, in this regard, are in the international mainstream, and the international mainstream accepts climate change, and they accept the duty of countries, nation states, to do something to alleviate climate change. Yeah, so to conclude, we have a current political system in the United States where we have a smaller and smaller party that currently has control of the Senate and the executive branch and is packing the Supreme Court. But is facing a crucial election in 2 years, and it's not looking good for them. They may be out of power in 2 years, but as long as the shrinking coterie, this small party and ever shrinking party retains this hold on power, you're going to see a government and a country and a foreign policy that is not interested in multiculturalism, compromise, or cooperation with other states, and that has made professional carrying out your duties as a diplomat almost impossible. And so maybe during the Q's and A's part, we can discuss any specific ways in which this would make your profession almost impossible to carry out. Yeah.